excited to welcome Kathleen DuVal. She's a native of Fayetteville, Arkansas. And she was standing there at the entrance, and I think she knew 3/4 of the audience. Kathleen, you're coming home. John and Kay, her parents, are here in the front. Would you stand up and turn around and take credit for producing someone like Kathleen? My beloved wife, Judy, was a teacher in Fayetteville Public Schools for 17 years. And like anyone that teaches, you have students that you will never forget. And Kathleen certainly was one of them. Judy started the Connotations, the Fayetteville Public High School's literary magazine. Kathleen was the editor, and she took it to the next level. It swept awards at the Columbia Scholastic Press Association. Honey, did I get that right? Wow. She prepped me on the way in. Kathleen received her BA at Stanford, her PhD at the University of California, Davis. She had a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. She currently holds the Bowman and Gordon Gray Professor in History at UNC Chapel Hill. And she does her scholarship on early American and American Indian history. She's the author of 2 books, a co-author with her father of a third, and with the Guggenheim Fellow, she began writing a book on American Indian dominance in the centuries before 1850. So Kathleen, welcome to the Pryor Center, and thank you for traveling today.
Thank you so much, Bill, and to Judy, and to my parents. I always say Judy taught me everything I know about writing, except my parents. They taught me that too. Today I'm going to talk about Tecumseh in Arkansas in the early 19th century. But I'm going to start a little farther away from here and a little closer in time. Lakota Indian Country, North Dakota in the fall of 2016. The road leading into the Oceti-Shikoan camp was lined with flags. The Standing Rock Sioux had been protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline since early that year. And recently, the growing crowd of protesters had spread to the second and larger camp across the Cannonball River. Flying over the trucks and cars and horses and tents, teepees, newly constructed wood-framed buildings, and thousands of demonstrators were dozens of flags. As you can see in the pictures, the red, white, and black stripes of the Arapaho Nation, the Northern Cheyenne Morning Star, the Black Sparrow Hawk of the Sac and Fox Nation, and the Navajo Flag. The Navajo Flag over there has sort of that sand-colored shape of the lands of the Navajo, and the rainbow over it represents Navajo sovereignty. Oceti-Shikoan is Dakota Sioux for 7 council fires, standing for the 7 Sioux nations. But some demonstrators began calling the camp the Oceti Oyate, which means all nations. The flags and the people who gathered under them showed the protests wide support across Indian country. But they also revealed the single biggest misunderstanding that Americans today have about Indians. As the Standing Rock Sioux tribal chairman put it, we're a nation, and we expect to be treated like a nation. The Standing Rock Sioux were demanding their rights as a sovereign nation, and other American Indians who supported them, they came not just as individuals, but representing nations, as their flags show. And in fact, I've heard that there were some members of the Standing Sioux Nation who didn't particularly like that some people were calling this camp all nations, because as they pointed out, this is not really all nations, this is still Sioux country. Over and over in the 19th and 20th centuries, Europeans and white Americans predicted Indians' demise. And some Americans today kind of think Indians did die off. And sometimes that takes the shape of sort of an abstract thinking of Indians as characters in a tragedy of the past, rather than real living Native people. But worse than that, I think, are the experiences of my students who arrive at UNC. From Native communities, they come fully confident of who they are. And then they feel that confidence start to erode as nearly everybody they meet if they happen to mention that they're Cherokee or Lumbee or Occaneechi. They get a bewildered response of something along the lines of, "Oh, there are still Indians?" In reality, not only have American Indians survived repeated predictions of their demise and concerted efforts to make those predictions come true, they have remained nations with separate sovereignties, identities, languages, art, beliefs, rituals, histories, and methods of dealing with federal, state, city, and other tribal governments. It is amazing that they did it, that there still remain today over 500 separate Native nations within the bounds of the United States, and many, many more throughout the rest of the Americas. There were other ways that the continent's future might have gone, and one of those many different historical possibilities was that Native nations would cease to exist as separate sovereignties, that we wouldn't today have Quapaws and Chickasaws, that they either would have assimilated into the white population or into the free people of color population, or that they might have become a generalized American Indian minority within the United States. The men and women of Native nations in the 19th and 20th centuries made sure that possible future didn't come to pass, that they remained separate nations. Which brings us to Tecumseh and his idea that Native nations all should become one. The story of Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, and their efforts to recruit Native followers in Arkansas and other parts of Indian country in the early 19th century can help us to understand how it is that Native nations managed to survive, and that they did so in part by saying no to Tecumseh. The story of Tecumseh is usually told these days, when it's told at all, as a righteous challenge to U.S. expansion that failed because the U.S. was too powerful, and because not enough Indians identified and acted as a unified people. According to this thinking, and I think this is the way that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa would tell it, the failure of Native people to all work together to become one accelerated Native land losses. But Native people whom they tried to recruit in Arkansas give us a different perspective on that history. Now, it is possible that if they had joined, a continent-wide pan-Indian movement might have carved out some of the continent as permanent Native space. That is possible. But on the other hand, even if that's true, and it's possible that nothing could stand up against the United States at that point, but even if a unified Native America could have fought off the United States to some extent, it was the insistence that by Quapaws and Chickasaws and Osage and Senecas and Caddos that they are Quapaws and Chickasaws and Osage and Senecas and Caddos. It was their insistence on separate identities that enabled Indians to remain nations through the horrors of the 19th and 20th centuries, and to remain nations with sovereign rights within the United States today. And why there's currently a renaissance going on in Indian country. Now, you can see that renaissance in activism, like at Standing Rock, but you can also see it any day if you walk into just about any tribal office or community center and look at the posters that are hanging up for language classes and cultural and historical events and various kinds of projects that they've started. They're teaching and learning about language or pottery or dances that are particular to their nation. And that's partly possible because of decisions that their ancestors made in crisis periods, including the one in the early 19th century, and including the decision not to follow Tecumseh. Tonight we're going to travel to Arkansas and to other places with Tecumseh as he tried to recruit followers. But I'm going to start in 1775 at Old Pequot, a Shawnee town on the Mad River in what's now the state of Ohio. There, triplet boys were born to a Shawnee father and a Creek mother. One of the triplets would become the prophet Tenskwatawa, and one of their older brothers was 7-year-old Tecumseh. Their father had died at the Battle of Point Pleasant, fighting the Virginia militia just a few months earlier. So it was their older brothers who would teach Tecumseh, Tenskwatawa, and the other younger boys how to hunt, and who took them on raids against squatters in Kentucky. Both boys were at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the last of their older brothers was killed. It was 10 years after that, in the spring of 1805, when Tenskwatawa had the vision that would direct his path thereafter. In Tenskwatawa's vision, the Master of Life showed him a rich and fertile country, abounding in game, fish, pleasant hunting grounds, and fine cornfields. Shawnees could live there if they returned to older ways of clothing and economics, if they gave up alcohol, private property, and violence against one another. Tenskwatawa's vision appealed to many Shawnees. Their world had changed fast, and the change was hard to make sense of. In just the 30 years of Tenskwatawa's life, hunting and trade had shrunk, tens of thousands of white Americans had moved into the Ohio Valley, and the U.S. military and squatters had forced Shawnees off a part of their land. It was a shocking turn of events. Like most people, the Shawnees saw themselves as the center of the world and the center of the Creator's purpose. An earlier Shawnee speechmaker had said 2 years before Tenskwatawa's vision, "The Master of Life made the Shawnees before any others of the human race and gave them all the knowledge which he himself possessed." Indeed, that Shawnee claimed, all the other red people are descended from the Shawnees. And the Shawnees for many ages continued to be masters of the continent, using the knowledge which they had received. Only a bit more modestly, George Bluejacket said in 1829, "We were a great people. Our men were great warriors. We fought many tribes and always beat them." So there were Shawnees at the time of Tenskwatawa's vision who found his preaching appealing. He told them how the Master of Life had shown him that the game hadn't completely disappeared the way it seemed to have when they looked around. He said, "The deer are merely half a tree's length underground. If they did as the Master of Life said, if they followed his teachings, the Master of Life would turn the earth over, and the deer would soon appear again. The Master of Life promised the prophet," Tenskwatawa said, "if you Indians will do everything I tell you, I will turn over the land so the white people are covered, and you alone shall possess the land." The Shawnees were hardly alone in looking to overturn the past few decades of history. While the independence of the United States would not affect people in the West, Navajos and Kiowas, for another couple of generations, Indians east of the Appalachian Mountains knew its threat intimately. And now, by 1810, a million Americans had crossed over the Appalachian Mountains. So the 100,000 Indians living there, 100,000, which had seemed pretty big before that million came in. The 100,000 Indians living between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River were looking urgently for new explanations and ways to make it stop. Between the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, a large number of Native peoples were living in closer proximity than in the past, because many of them had moved there, fleeing the violence in the east. You can see on this map, it's a modern-day reconstruction of what it was like then, how closely clustered these different nations are in this space that many of them have come to recently. These resettlements in the Ohio Valley had required a tremendous amount of diplomacy and continuing coordination among the various newcomers and the various people who already lived there, whose nations already were in this region. The kind of intricate alliance-building, kinship-building diplomacy that the United States did not tend to do when it moved into new places. In 1829, looking back, George Bluejacket recalled these native migrations as a success. He said, "North of the Great Sepe, the great river, the Ohio River, here we were given much land by our brothers, the Wyandots. We built many towns and lived in peace." Still, George Bluejacket's grandparents and parents remained Shawnees. Throughout their migrations, Shawnees maintained a Shawnee identity through shared culture and language, through careful cultivation of ties across their scattered communities, because only some of them came to the Ohio Valley. And as diplomats and network builders in the places where they went, they gained a reputation of helping other people to get along with each other. But being Shawnee and identifying as Shawnee didn't mean being unified politically. Even as leaders that sometimes tried to create a centralized Shawnee leadership, Shawnees continued to primarily identify as smaller political groups, as towns, as families. So both intertribal organizers like Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh, people who said all Indians need to coordinate with each other, and Shawnee leaders who said all Shawnees need to work together at least. We need to be a more unified nation. All of them wanted more political centralization than most Shawnee men and women probably wanted. But still, Tenskwatawa's message resonated with many people. Don't know how to do a Mac. Pretend you see a picture of Tenskwatawa and a map. So by 1806, his followers had chosen a location on Greenville Creek, which would be up there. But I'll just tell you, it was a northern tributary of the Ohio River. And that's where he was going to build a new town, where people would come together, people of various Native nations would come together. Delawares and Wyandots came to hear him. Some Ottawas pilgrimaged from the south. Miamis, Potawatomis, and Ho-Chunks came from the west around Lake Michigan, and some Sacs traveled from the Rock River on the upper Mississippi. Yes, thank you. They built a 5,000 square foot council house where Tenskwatawa preached and celebrants danced. And some settled in to stay for a while. Women planted corn and beans and pumpkins. You could hear trees being cut down to build houses, 50 houses, 60 houses, and more. The camp meeting atmosphere at Greenville would have been recognizable to white and black Americans as a religious community in the making. As with any good religious revival, some people who came to Greenville Creek went home to evangelize. In May of 1807, an Ottawa man called the Trout was back home 400 miles north of Greenville Creek at L'Arbre Croche, near where Lake Michigan and Lake Huron meet. And the Trout spoke to an open council of men, women, and children, and he conveyed Tenskwatawa's message. So listen here to how the Trout's version isn't just about the Shawnees, isn't just about Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh's people, and it isn't just about the Ottawas, just about the Trout's people. And also I need to tell you, he's speaking in the voice of God. So the I here is actually God, but it's coming through the mouth of the Trout. My red children have become scattered and miserable. The solution? You are to have very little intercourse with the whites. The whites I placed on the other side of the Great Lake, the Atlantic, that they might be a separate people. His red children could play ball against one another, but he said, you are never to go to war against each other, but to cultivate peace between your different tribes, that they may become one great people. Now, separate creations, the idea that God had made white people and black people and red people separately and meant them to stay separate, was not a new or particularly radical idea in 1807. Pontiac had preached it 50 years earlier. And neither was it radical for tribes to coordinate. That had been happening for hundreds, thousands of years probably. And in fact, Shawnee leader Blackhoof and Miami leader Little Turtle, I'll be talking more about these men later. So Blackhoof, who's a Shawnee leader, Little Turtle, who's a Miami leader. They and others had been working in the Ohio Valley to try to implement new kinds of coordination among their nations, including an agreement among some of the nations, some of the towns, that they wouldn't sell any land without all of them agreeing. So all that was going on. But what was radical in 1807 was the Creator's wish that Indians become one great people. You can hear how far Tenskwatawa had developed that idea by a speech that he gave the following year. Tenskwatawa said, "The religion which I have established for the last 3 years, which has been attended to by the different tribes of Indians in this part of the world, those Indians were once different people. They are now but one. They are all determined to practice what I have communicated to them that has come directly from the Great Spirit through me." Now, pretty soon it proved that Greenville Creek was too close to Americans, so Tenskwatawa moved his settlement to the Tippecanoe River on lands that the Miami Indians considered their own. That's Prophetstown on the map. There somewhere. Little Turtle, a leader of the Miamis, complained, "This is Miami land." Tenskwatawa replied, when he was accused of settling on Miami land, he said he would not change his plans, which had been laid by all the Indians in America. By 1808, becoming and being one people was the message of Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, and they carried it far and wide. Their confidence and rhetorical power persuaded some people of their day, and ever since, of the self-evident truth of their message. But there were many who did not see the world Tenskwatawa's way. But there were many who did not see the world Tenskwatawa's way, who did not agree that Indians are now but one. Which brings me to Shawnee leader Blackhoof. Blackhoof rejected Tenskwatawa's message in favor of his own vision of Shawnee nationhood, and, not incidentally, his own leadership of the Shawnee Nation. Since the 1790s, Blackhoof had been working to centralize Shawnee political leadership and to implement economic changes, both of which he believed would help the Shawnees firm up their position in the Ohio Valley. They started raising cattle and selling meat and dairy products, growing cash crops to sell. They built a grist mill and a sawmill. They leased out tribal land, which not only gave them rent in the short term, it also put Shawnee land ownership sort of in the courts in a way that it would make sense. It would be more like once you've rented out land, it sort of legally exists in a way that tribal land might not. They couldn't trust that tribal land would. And they invited a Quaker missionary to help them break into new markets. Sometimes these kinds of efforts are portrayed as assimilating, as trying to be like white Americans. But really, leaders like Blackhoof were trying to lead their nations into a new future as a 19th century Shawnee nation. Now, Tenskwatawa would not agree with my interpretation there at all. He thought Blackhoof was a huge sellout. He charged that Blackhoof and leaders like him abandoned the interests of their nations and sold all the Indians' land to the United States. And in fact, he said that they had asked the president to appoint masters over them. And that's perhaps who these Quaker missionaries were. Tenskwatawa went after nationalizing, modernizing leaders like Blackhoof. And he also went after tribal religious leaders. Tenskwatawa led witch hunts against Delaware religious leaders who rejected his demand that they give up their tribally specific ceremonies. He was the prophet, he said. He was the voice of the Great Spirit, and those who said otherwise were blasphemous. Now, right in the midst of this early stage of Tenskwatawa's evangelism, in September 1809, Little Turtle and other Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi leaders signed the Treaty of Fort Wayne. In that treaty, they ceded over 3 million acres to the United States. And this seemed to be proof to many people that Tenskwatawa's and Tecumseh's way was the right way. Frustrated and angry, new people started coming to Prophetstown, to Tenskwatawa's camp, including people who considered the treaty a violation of the earlier agreements that I mentioned, that they not sell land without everybody agreeing. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh agreed with them and threatened to kill the chiefs who signed the treaty. Now, this is according to William Henry Harrison, who is not a 100% reliable documenter, shall we say, but it may or may not be exactly true. But according to Harrison, Tecumseh declared that his followers will no longer suffer any village chiefs to manage the affairs of the Indians, and that I, Tecumseh, am authorized by all the tribes. I am the head of all of them, and alone the acknowledged chief of all the Indians. Now, whether he said it or not, it certainly wasn't true. It wasn't just leaders like Blackhoof and Little Turtle who had no desire to yield political authority over their nations and their towns. Even many ordinary Shawnees had deduced from the troubles since the American Revolution that it was best to stay put and try to get along with everybody, including Americans. In fact, in the coming battles against the United States in 1812 and 1813, there would be Shawnees that fought on both sides, some that fought and spied for the Americans. And most Shawnees would stay out of the fighting completely. In fact, more than half of Shawnees lived west of the Mississippi by the time that the fighting began, including most of Tecumseh's kin. I'll talk about them more in a moment when we cross the Mississippi. None of this is to say that there was a right way to fight the United States in the 1810s, but it's important to recognize that neither revivalists like Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, nor native religious leaders, nor native Christians, nor advocates of Blackhoof's kind of economic and political changes none of them accepted white Americans' categorization of Indians as subordinate, deficient, and doomed. They were all fighting in different ways. Tecumseh carried the vision of one people far beyond the Ohio Valley. Harrison marveled in 1811 that for 4 years, Tecumseh has been in constant motion. You see him today on the Wabash River, and in a short time you hear of him on the shores of Lake Erie or Michigan, or on the banks of the Mississippi. And wherever he goes, he makes an impression favorable to his purposes. People gathered and listened to the increasingly famous speaker. But in every place, local history, conditions, needs, beliefs, and power structures affected how they responded. When people considered Tecumseh's universalist message, they thought locally. Tecumseh toured the upper Mississippi River in the summer of 1810, and many people in Potawatomi towns were enthusiastic. Potawatomis had been traveling to hear Tecumseh's words since at least 1808. In fact, in the spring of 1808, Potawatomi leaders had called their people together to consider the message of the prophet, to consider how to respond. Some supported the prophet. Others wanted to, as they put it, put down the prophet's advocates and put the Potawatomis in the right place again. A Potawatomi prophet named Maine Pock was one of Tenskwatawa's greatest allies in the West. Apparently, it was Maine Pock's idea, actually, that the town moved to the Tippecanoe River, to Prophetstown, so that to be a little closer to the Potawatomis. And in fact, he volunteered Potawatomi women to bring food to the camp while they were waiting for their first year's crops to come in. Tecumseh kept going. In 1810, he went to Peoria towns on the Illinois River, Winnebagos on the Rock River, and Menominees on Green Bay. He spoke to diverse people gathered at the post of Prairie du Chien. Then he descended the Mississippi River, spoke to the Sauks and the Foxes, and he crossed the Mississippi into Arkansas. In Arkansas, Tecumseh met with the Shawnees and Delawares who had moved west in previous decades. In all of these places, the answer that Tecumseh most often got was something like, okay, yes, that sounds great. We want to join your movement as soon as we finish our war against these guys over here. And the guys over here were other Indians. These wars between Indians created huge problems for Tecumseh. Of course, there were practical problems. It meant that the military effort was directed away from who was supposed to be the enemy, the United States, and toward potential allies, other Indians. It meant that resources got focused on Western wars instead of coming to support Prophetstown and its armed forces. And obviously, these wars completely undercut the message of being one people. The Shawnees living in Arkansas must have driven Tecumseh crazy. These were his people. They had come west to get away from Americans. And yet all of their military effort was going into their very intense war against the Osage Indians here in Arkansas and in Missouri. Because where the Shawnees lived, I'm calling Arkansas, but the Osage called Osage country. To them, the Shawnees had moved in on their land. Shawnee diplomatic efforts here focused on building a military alliance against the Osage with as many people as possible. So the Shawnees were trying to build an alliance with Delawares, who had already moved here at the same time as the Shawnees, with Cherokees, who had also moved west for some of the same reasons, with Quapaws, who already lived here, with Maine Pock and the Potawatomis just across the Mississippi River, who had long fought the Osage on both sides of the Mississippi. And the Shawnees were trying to build an alliance, and this is the most troubling part for Tecumseh's purposes, trying to build an alliance with French colonists who still lived in Arkansas, even after it had become part of the United States. They themselves had long been hemmed in by the Osage and were delighted to have new allies against them. Maine Pock himself, the Potawatomi prophet, as much as he aligned himself with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, he never included the Osage in the native people who were supposed to be allied. Right after he met with Tenskwatawa for the first time at Greenville Creek in the fall of 1807, Maine Pock went back west with two objectives: spread the word of Tenskwatawa's vision and muster fighters to go fight the Osage. Things were even a little muddy at Prophetstown, the heart of Tenskwatawa's movement. Some Kickapoos there in 1810 told a Frenchman that they knew the prophet Tenskwatawa intended to lead them to war, but they weren't totally sure if it was against the United States or against the Osage. It was the United States. It was not the Osage. Tecumseh tried to persuade the Shawnees west of the Mississippi to stop fighting the Osage. At the time of his 1810 visit there, an Osage war party had just killed 2 Shawnees, one of whom was related to Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. So Tecumseh's words should have carried particular weight as he spoke of unity and forgetting past offenses. And maybe they did, but the war with the Osage didn't end. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh went further, though, and they sent emissaries directly to the Osage. And it seems that Tecumseh went there himself in the fall of 1811, though I'm not 100% sure. He certainly sent emissaries, and a Creek prophet named Francis was there with the message of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. And in the fall of 1811, they spoke to Osage chief Powhuska's gathered people. Now, recruiting the Osage makes sense. They were a strong and militarily successful people, and their thousands of fighting men could make a big difference if war against the United States came. And also, Tecumseh may have seen recruiting the Osage as ultimate proof of his movement's truth. Now, we may tend to see defeating the United States and holding back settlement as their primary goal. But the wars against the Osage were long, lasting, and serious. Truly being one people would require ending old animosities like that one. And in turn, ending those animosities would surely seem to be the work and the will of the Creator, would prove the truth of the movement. A white man named John Dunn Hunter was raised a captive among the Osage. And the recollections that he wrote down much later are the only account of what Tecumseh said, if he was there, to the gathered Osage. So think of this as a sort of maybe partly imagined version of what Tecumseh might have said to the gathered Osage. This is what Hunter said that Tecumseh said to them. Brothers, we all belong to one family. We are all children of the Great Spirit. We walk in the same path, slake our thirst at the same spring. And now affairs of the greatest concern lead us to smoke the pipe around the same council fire. Brothers, my people are brave and numerous, but the white people are too strong for them alone. I wish you to take up the tomahawk with them. If we all unite, we will cause the rivers to stain the great waters with their blood. Brothers, if you do not unite with us, they will first destroy us, and then you will fall an easy prey to them. They have destroyed many nations of red men because they were not united, because they were not friends to one another. Brothers, we must be united. We must smoke the same pipe. We must fight each other's battles. And more than all, we must love the Great Spirit. He is for us. He will destroy our enemies and make all his red children happy. Powhuska and the Osage would have none of it. Tecumseh's fight was not their fight. Shawnee history was not Osage history. The Osage rivalry with Potawatomi Saukes and various Illinois peoples who had joined the movement, that rivalry was old, maybe going back as far as before the Osage moved west of the Mississippi, centuries before this. It was partly in response to Potawatomi and Sauk raids at the turn of the 18th century that Osage had recruited French trade and established themselves as an expansionist fur trading power. The Osage people had militarily expanded over the past century, conquering, expelling, or controlling everyone in their way, Europeans and natives alike. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that Tecumseh was right. By the end of the 19th century, the United States would dominate the continent, and in the next century, the world. But for now, the Osage still had the upper hand in interactions with outsiders. People feared them. Osage men shaved most of their hair to exaggerate their already pretty tall height, and then they tied up the top of it with a 5-inch roach, so often with a porcupine quill or an eagle feather coming up over that, bringing their total height to well over 7 feet. Thomas Jefferson, no shorty at 6'2", referred to the Osage as certainly the most gigantic men we have ever seen. You can almost hear Jefferson's fear coming down through the ages. To the Osage, the Shawnees, Delawares, and Cherokees who had moved west were squatting on Osage land. They were the problem, not the solution. Now, in 1805, a delegation of Osage had signed a peace treaty at St. Louis with some of these rivals because the United States had promised to keep the peace, in part by keeping other Indians off of Osage land. But the peace hadn't held, and the Osage blamed the Potawatomis for breaking it. And also blamed them for capturing more than 30 Osage women and children who were still being held captive in Kickapoo, Sauk, and Fox towns east of the Mississippi at the very time that they were hearing the message of Tecumseh. Still, it may be that it was the religious message that they rejected even more than the political one. In Hunter's recollection, the Osage leaders were impressed by Tecumseh's eloquence, and they did talk about his military and diplomatic advice and counsel. But the Creek prophet Francis, his speech, which Hunter said enlarged considerably more on the power and disposition of the Great Spirit, so it was more religious in tone. That speech, Hunter believed, did more injury than benefit to the cause he undertook to espouse. In 1811, Osage people may have been willing to start to consider new military and diplomatic alliances, but they were not interested at all in this movement's call to give up specifically Osage ways for beliefs and practices that to them probably seemed more Shawnee or Creek than universal, and probably more Christian than anything they wanted any part of. And Osage weren't the only one. There's a historian at Hendrix College, Jonathan Hancock, who has shown in his research that Potawatomis chafed against Tenskwatawa's prohibitions on their medicine bags and sacred songs. Maine Pock sort of, unlike Tenskwatawa, kind of walked the line on this one. He encouraged Potawatomi traditions and practices even as he was talking about universalism. As Hancock puts it, Maine Pock ultimately refused to cede spiritual and political authority to the Shawnee brothers. Similarly, a Sauk Indian man named Wanabea told an American in the 1820s, so after this, in the 1820s, "We always carry medicine bags about us when we take them when we go to war. We administer their contents to our relations when they are sick. They have been transmitted to us by our forefathers, who received them at the hands of the great master of life himself." And yet, Wanabea recalled, "Some of us did at one time, at the instigation of the Shawnee prophet, throw them away." Wanabea remembered that Tenskwatawa and his emissaries had told them, he said, that our medicine in our bags, which had been good in its time, had lost its efficacy. And so many of our chiefs cast away their bags. But this proved to be the source of many heavy calamities. It brought on the death of all who parted with their bags. Wanabea was looking back after military defeats that do happen at the end of Tecumseh's movement. And he found answers in the religious beliefs and practices of his forefathers, of Sauks. Tecumseh also made a tour of the Southeast to try to recruit Creeks, Chickasaws, and Choctaws. He was especially optimistic about Creek country because the brothers had both Creek and Shawnee relatives living in Creek country. Now, when Chickasaws and Choctaws listened to Tecumseh speak, there was much that rang true. The United States was a startling new force that clearly required new solutions. Tecumseh's talk of declining game surely struck a chord in the Southeast, much more than in Arkansas, where there was still plenty of game. And they did find some recruits there, including Francis, the Creek prophet that I talked about in Creek country. But there were many ways of facing this new threat, and lots of people there, too, thought Tecumseh was a harjo, which is a Creek word for a crazy person, a kind of interesting person, but a pretty crazy person. They listened and discussed, but almost universally, Choctaws and Chickasaws declined to join. As for the Creeks, many of them would follow the prophet's teachings, and they would create the Red Stick movement. But rather than fight with Tecumseh against the United States, the Creeks would descend into civil war, the Red Stick War. That was the worst outcome, the exact opposite of what Tecumseh had hoped for. but perhaps a possibility that Blackhoof could have predicted. Oops. If you will, imagine Osage Chief Powhuska and Shawnee Chief Blackhoof riding into Ochedi-Shikowan. That's not them, but imagine. Their descendants might come up to them and say, we've got some bad news about the rest of your century and the 20th century and ongoing colonialism today, including pipelines. But they would also, I think, have some good news for these men who opposed Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's efforts to reduce their sovereignty and power every bit as they opposed white outsiders. Native nations didn't vanish or become white Americans or become a single Native American identity. And the roots of those national survivals lie in fighting European empires and the United States in many different ways. And they lie in the refusal to accept the view that all Indians are or should be the same. Thanks. So I think I have time for questions. Right? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you.
You couldn't really communicate very well?
Yeah, so the question is about language. Could the different tribes talk to each other, or could they even communicate through language? And they have, it's different in different places, but in most of these places there is an interpreter, or even in some cases maybe a string of interpreters if they need more than one to get from one language to another. My impression is that Tecumseh could speak a range of languages related to both Shawnee and Creek, and probably could be understood in those regions, but certainly by the time he was talking to Osage or Quapaws, he would have needed an interpreter. But there's such a long history of Native diplomacy that interpreter is a pretty a standard. There is an interpreter around, right? It's already a role that some people play. Yeah, but it is another, it's a constant reminder to them in their diplomacy that they are not the same people, that they need interpreters to talk to each other.
Kathleen, I loved your talk.
Thank you, Sean.
Hey, a friend of mine is Creek, good old friend of mine. And he, over the years, was always proud to say that Tecumseh was actually Creek because his mother was Creek.
Right.
And as we know, the Creek people, like a lot of the southeastern Native groups, are matrilineal.
Yeah.
So if he had a Creek mother, that would make him Creek.
Right.
And that might, I don't know, would that have a lot to do with the way that Tecumseh was received down in Creek country?
Yeah.
And what is the place, or was the place, of Native women in this movement to ally the tribes?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa had a Shawnee father and a Creek mother. Shawnees are patrilineal and Creeks are matrilineal. So they were, that's the way you want to do it if you have a choice, which you don't, of course. But he was 100% Shawnee and 100% Creek. And I do think Creeks saw him as 100% Creek. He had a clan and everything. And there's some evidence he spent some time in Creek country early in his life, too. And so probably was pretty good with language there. And I do think that was more, he was an insider when he was in Creek country in a way that he wasn't in any of these other places except with Shawnees. And I think by both his birth and also the fact that he lived some with both sides, it may have made it easier for him to imagine a coming together of different peoples, that a person could be of multiple nations in ways that maybe some other people weren't quite as able to imagine if they felt fully just one tribe. Women, the problem with most of the documents about this are written by basically spies, American spies who go into these camps and write down everything they see. And some of them are by people who live with the nations and are just sort of write it down later, like Hunter. And these men who write things down don't notice women, right? And so, but when you read through the lines and you realize, oh, there's somebody planting corn and there's somebody bringing corn, the women feed these camps. And feeding, there are many times when they almost starve. And so feeding, if it were only food, would be essential anyway. But in Native diplomacy, maybe in all diplomacy, but certainly in Native diplomacy, feeding and hosting diplomacy is not possible without feasts and hosts that involve food and housing, which women are also in charge of. So this movement would not have happened at all without women. And I should say that. I should say that more often. But it's hard to say it at any more than that general level, because the names of the women and what they did is not really talked about much. Occasionally there's a female prophet, but I haven't run across any female prophets in this movement. In other movements there are.
What happened to Tecumseh?
Oh, well, it didn't go that well. Yes, I don't like to tell the ends of stories. Yes. He is killed at Tippecanoe, at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and Harrison goes on to run on a platform of having killed Tecumseh. His slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because his running mate is John Tyler. And he runs as the hero of Tippecanoe, although that is not exactly the way it happened.
What year was that?
What year was that? 1813. Thank you. Yeah, so pretty soon after this, Tenskwatawa lives a long time, and so there are interviews with Tenskwatawa later on, and so some of the information about him, and it's looking back on an earlier period when things have not gone that well. But some of the sources are from Tenskwatawa because he lives much longer. Yeah.
I'm interested in the threat of the medicine bags to Tecumseh's whole idea of unification. It's not sort of like, well, the Catholics can be this way and the Protestants this way, the Orthodox this way, but we're all Christian?
Right.
Yeah.
No. And I think it's easier, I think, for us today to understand his movement as a political one, and I think that doesn't get it right. That his movement is a religious one, and it's not that, we'll all get together politically and militarily, and you could keep on doing things the way you've been doing. You can be a Catholic, and we can all be. He does not think that. The Great Spirit speaks through him, and it's a combination, as often happens with prophets, I suppose, generally. It's a combination of a return to the old that isn't something, quite new. And then the focus on him, right, as being the voice of the Great Spirit is different from what most people believe. And then asking them to get rid of their particular religious ways and beliefs that are tied to their own nation or their, smaller or larger forms of that, and to turn to religion the way he says it should be, or the way the Great Spirit tells him it should be, is new and is maybe the single biggest reason for people opposing him.
Thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. There's also, I think, an historical tradition that Tecumseh's message was not to oppose the whites militarily. That he realized those numbers that you mentioned, 1 million and 100,000. He realized that was not going to work. It was rather to, form a united diplomatic front to surrender no more land. And in fact, it was at the Battle of Tippecanoe. It was Tecumseh's betrayal of that call in attacking Harrison that led to his downfall. And did you see any of that?
Yeah, it seems that people like Blackhoof think. So many people think Tecumseh at the time thought Tecumseh wanted to attack the United States. I think, so much of that information is filtered through Harrison and other government officials who are so paranoid. They're both paranoid and self-centered. So they think, of course, this whole movement must be about us. And so I think it's hard to get at that truth. I think that's why historians, debate about that, some of what he really wanted to do, because then he does end up in this. Well, I should say, the War of 1812 happens, and it opens up possibilities for fighting against the United States that are really not not as possible before Britain is back at war against the United States. So, I mean, it is possible that this isn't what he wanted from the beginning and gets pulled into it, which I think would bring me even farther toward that position that this is an argument about religion and identity, not in the way that they would put it, but who we are. Because it's not just let's agree across our nations, across our towns, not to sell land. It is more than that. But its primary purpose may not be fighting the United States.
So is Tecumseh's death the end of an attempt to unify the tribes?
So the question is, was Tecumseh's death the end of an attempt to unify the tribes? And I would say it's sort of the end of this attempt, although this one does continue for a few years after this. But it is not the end of the attempts. There will be more in the future. And still questions today, about how unified to be. Anything else?
Have you seen any of the cedar bundles that he passed out? Here you go. Have you been able to see any of the artifacts, the cedar bundles that he passed out?
No, have you?
There's some in the, I think it's the Ohio Historical Museum, or some of the Ohio or Indiana. There are some.
Oh, I did not know
extant,
that.
yeah.
Oh, I will have to do that.
I've been fascinated.
Yeah.
I did question. Any evidence as to how the Cherokees responded to Tecumseh in Arkansas? A really growing population in the early 19th century.
Yeah, right. I think the Cherokees should have been a sort of fruitful place for this message. But I think among the leadership of the Cherokees, I'm just going to now make things up because I don't have any direct evidence of what happened, except that they didn't really join the movement. But I would imagine them receiving, the leaders who would be listening to it at least, might receive it a bit like Blackhoof did, that they were, that the Cherokees could work with Delawares and Shawnees, they could work with Quapaws, they were really good diplomats, but that it was diplomacy, it was not becoming one people, that they were firmly Cherokees, and in part had moved west to remain Cherokees.
Didn't like the Creeks very much either.
Right, exactly, right. There's so many, I could take up the whole time of the talk talking about all the different peoples who wouldn't want to fight on the same side, yeah, exactly.
I'm just curious about the populations of the lower Mississippi River Valley, like the Quapaw. I know by 1800 there were less than 1,000 Quapaw, and I learned that from one of your articles I read. And so I was just wondering, were the peoples of the lower Mississippi River Valley included in this movement?
Yeah, so this is another case where there's nobody writing about who's there and hears it and writes about it, but Tecumseh comes right here. So comes right to not here, but to the right on the Mississippi. So he is in Quapaw country, and so he must have talked to Quapaws. Quapaws talk to everybody who comes through. And so if I were to again sort of imagine because they don't end up, I don't know of Quapaws fighting. On the side of Tecumseh. Quapaws had a very delicate relationship with the Osage and had stayed out of war with them for forever, right? And so I would think it would be sort of in line with Quapaw foreign policy at the time to listen to Tecumseh, to say that sounds exciting, that tell us more, and to tell us about the news in the East, and not to make any promises, because I think for the Quapaws at this point, the most important, and for a long time before this, the most important thing was getting along with everybody, including these new immigrants. The Quapaws did in some ways it's sort of parallel to what I was talking about was happening in the Ohio Valley with the Wyandots and others, welcoming in Shawnees and Delawares and figuring out a way to live with more people on land that really was theirs. The Quapaws also saw a lot of benefits in Cherokees coming and Delawares and Shawnees coming and helping them protect their land. And so Tecumseh's message would have not worked with that very well.
Kathleen DuVal. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Well, you can't leave the Pryor Center without a few gifts. We have a crystal paperweight with the Pryor Center logo on it. There you go. Here goes my event calendar. The autobiography of David Pryor. And most importantly, a Pryor Center cup. How could we outdo that? And a bag. Can't much better than that. Remember, a week from tonight, we have Alex Kingsbury of the New York Times. And if you're interested in the topic of contemporary Native people, we have a lecture series this spring, sponsored by the School of Journalism and Strategic Media. And on the 29th of February, we have Shane Brown, who's a Cherokee, who will be enlightening us. So, pardon? 26. Okay, 26. Put this on your refrigerator door so I don't screw you up, okay? Thank you again. Drive safe. Thank you. That was wonderful.